Hey guys, today we're in the book of Deuteronomy chapter 16. We are finishing the third section of Deuteronomy, talking about how Israel should worship God. And so this chapter is about the sacred holidays or the feasts that God has told us about in the book of Exodus and Numbers. But remember, this is the second law. This is the retelling to that second generation of Israelites. And so it starts out with the Passover or Pesach. And it talks about the Passover. They should keep the Passover in the month of Abib. Because that's when it happens. The month of Abib is normal our Passover around our springtime, normally around our Easter, because that's when it happened. But notice it says keep the Passover. Why is it important that they keep the Passover? Yes, it reminds them of what God did in Egypt, but it's prophetically looking forward to Jesus. All right, so you say, where's Jesus at in this chapter? Definitely the Passover, right? And so it is the sacrificial lamb that covers the sin that allows death to pass. And so it's important that they keep doing the Passover to prophetically look toward the Messiah, the anointed one that is to come again. But notice here something different. In verse 2, it says that they are to do this at the place that the Lord will choose. In Exodus, they did this at their house, right? At their house that they were doing. But as they cross over into the Promised Land, things change. They are no longer to do it at their house. They are to do it at the Tabernacle, the place where the Lord stops. Remember, the Lord will be moving, and wherever He designates for the tabernacle to be set, that's where they're going to do it. So it's no longer done in their house. It will be done at the tabernacle. That's where the sacrifice will be made, there in the presence of God. He says, you shall not eat unleavened bread with it. 7 days you shall eat with it unleavened bread. Remember, we have the feast of unleavened bread and Passover. They really happen at the same time. Passover starts at sundown and goes all the way into the next day until sundown again. And then at sundown, we count out 6 more days that they would eat unleavened bread, reminding them of when they left Egypt, they had to leave in a haste. They did not have time for yeast to rise. So God uses this as 6 days of purification for them to remove all the yeast from their house, from their pans, their cooking, their pantries, and it's to show that they're getting rid of sin. It's 6 days that they kind of devote right after Passover to holiness and to being sanctified, set apart, and remembering what God has done for them. And they do this for 6 days, and then that continues. Starting in verse 9, we have the second feast, or the second holiday, which is Pentecost. Now, Pentecost simply means 50. It's just the word of 50, right? So 50 days. And so it tells us that it starts 7 weeks. That's 49 days, so 50 days. Because it starts in the evening, right? So you would go 49 days starting at sundown, which would be the beginning of the 50th day. 50 days from when the first time they put sickle to the harvest. So this moves determining on the rain, on the agriculture of that forth, right? So it kind of moves a little bit, but it's always just kind of 50 days after the harvest, and then they celebrate the Feast of Weeks. What's interesting about this is the celebration of the Feast of Weeks is a joyful holiday. There is no sacrifice. There is no animal sacrifice to be made. They don't have to think about their sin. They don't have to think about how far they are from God. It's to be a joyful time because it's called Israel to bring a free will offering. Israel brings a free will offering to God to say that they are in communion. So it is a very happy feast. It's not a solemn feast like Passover or Tabernacles, but it is a joyous occasion. And if you remember the book of Exodus, Leviticus, this is where the wave offering happens, right? They bring it and the priest waves it in front of the tabernacle. And so this is just a time that they come and remember God's blessing in the harvest, and they bring a part of that harvest to God to sacrifice it, to thank him for what he has done. Then in verse 13, we see the third holy feast, which is the Feast of Booths, or also known as the Feast of Tabernacles. The word booth or tabernacle is the word Sukkot. And today you will hear Jews celebrate Sukkot. This is a 7-day festival where they will build tabernacles or booths. Now, when I say tabernacles, don't think of the tabernacle in which God lived in, but think of a hut. Think of putting some cardboard boxes, some sticks, and some twigs together. And so even today, people will build these outside of their house, and they will celebrate dinner every night outside in this makeshift temporary hut that they've built. And so this is an occasion to have friends and to have family over, to have big meals every night. They will celebrate with a meal for 7 days. And this is to be thankful to God that he made them through the wilderness, that he didn't kill them off in the wilderness, but he kept a remnant, a group of people, the second generation who he's talking to right now, Moses is talking to, in celebrating that God was faithful in keeping them in doing this. And so these 3 times of year, the men of Israel would have to come to the tabernacle. Well, this changes after King Solomon. Solomon builds a temple. The temple will always be in Jerusalem. And so this is why we see, as we get further in the Old Testament and even in the New Testament, especially when Jesus, he goes to the temple on Passover, on Pentecost, on Tabernacles. Every male was required to do it, and they had to bring an offering. It says, do not show up before the Lord empty-handed. They had to take an offering to God. And then we kind of get into the rules, which takes us into our 4th section, but we'll talk more about that tomorrow. And God just says, hey, you need to appoint some judges or some men and women before you, because he knew the future. He knew Israel, what they would do, because they've already done it. They slidden into sin, but they needed some people that would be just and righteous, and they would stand before the people with God's rule on one side and illustration and how they would live it on the other, and they would help people decipher. Remember, Moses did this. Moses couldn't do this. His father-in-law said, Moses, you need some help. And Moses did this, but now all those men have died. Moses will die before they cross over in the promised land. So God is making what Moses needed to do, and his 72 leaders, now he's doing that again. So he'll set judges and officials that will help rule the land in between kind of everyday living. God's word says this, so is this right or wrong? They needed some earthly men and women that could stand in the go-between. And so that's what God is doing. And so picking up these godly men. Then in the last 2 verses, verse 21, he says, you should not plant any tree as an Ashera beside the altar of the Lord your God that you shall make, and you shall not set up a pillar which the Lord God hates. God tells them not to do 3 things. 1, to build an Ashera. We will see this also in the Old Testament. You continue reading, known as Ashera poles. In your mind, it's best to think of them as totem poles, right? So think of Indians, think of Alaskans, think of a totem pole. This was a Canaanite practicing, worshiping the god of Ashera. It was a female god. And they would build these great totems in worshiping her, and it would give her her attributes and her divinity up these poles. So God says, don't be like the Canaanites. Don't build Asherah poles. And then he says, do not build an altar of the Lord that you will make, right? And you think, well, don't build an altar of the Lord. That seems good. Well, he knows that if they build other altars, they will start to worship other things. They are to come to the tabernacle and worship alone. So don't be like the Canaanites and the Hittites and the Perizzites who would build little altars everywhere to worship wooden images. Okay, so that's the second thing. And then lastly, do not build up pillars. And these would be pillars of stone that they would build up to show and to worship other gods, or to set golden statues or idols onto these pillars. So God is saying, hey, come and see me, celebrate with me, right? Find just judges that are among you that will help you live your life, and also don't fall into idol worship, right? And we've seen this almost every chapter about idols, because God knows it's going to be a huge fall for Israel when they start to move into the promised land, because they'll be surrounded by people who live and worship in these means. And so you might ask yourself, where is God in all of this? Well, where's Jesus in all of this? We've seen him in the Passover, right? The sacrificial lamb who takes away the sin, or allows death to cross over. We see him in Pentecost. Pentecost is important in the New Testament. Jesus resurrects, he ascends to the Father, and then some days later on Pentecost, he sends the Spirit, right? He sends the Spirit in this joyous occasion while everybody, all of the Israelite men are there in Jerusalem. He sends them there that they may hear the gospel and they may go and spread the news. And then again in the Feast of the Tabernacles, we see several times Jesus preaching in the temple of the Tabernacles to all the men who are there. But it also shows us the millennial state, to be in a booth, to be in a temporary place that is perfect in protection. That is what we will be in the 1,000-year reign until God comes back and fully sustains us in our perfect living. So you see Jesus in every single feast. So I hope that makes a little bit more sense, and we will see you tomorrow in chapter 17. God bless.